On March 20th, 2025, Edward Thomas James was executed by lethal injection after spending nearly 3 decades on death row. His crimes were as brutal as they were senseless, leaving a trail of devastation. In this video, we'll uncover the crimes he committed, his last meal, and his last words. But before we get into that, let's go back to how it all started. Eddie was born in Bristol, Pennsylvania in 1961. For years, he believed his stepfather was his real dad, never questioning the truth. But everything changed when he turned 11. That was when he finally met his biological father, the man who had left before he was even born. But instead of finding love, guidance, or stability, Eddie was pulled into something much worse. His father wasn't the role model he had imagined. By day, he worked as a drug counselor, but behind closed doors, he was an addict himself. And instead of keeping Eddie away from that world, he introduced his own son to drugs. By the time Eddie moved back in with his mother in Castleberry, Florida, he was already on a dark path. He was angry, violent, and constantly in trouble. His mother tried to help, turning to mental health professionals, hoping someone could set him straight. But nothing worked. His life spiraled into drinking, drugs, and fights, and with every year, he drifted further away from any chance of redemption. At 17, desperate for a way out, he joined the army hoping for a fresh start, but discipline couldn't fix what was already broken. Stationed in Germany, his behavior didn't improve, and before long, he was discharged for failure to conform. He was sent back home, right back to the chaos he had tried to escape. Back in Castleberry, things only got worse. Eddie bounced from job to job, drowning himself in drugs and alcohol and burning every bridge along the way. No one wanted him around. Then a family took him in, kind, trusting, and completely unaware they had just welcomed a future killer into their home. Eddie once had big plans. He and his friend Tim Dick were supposed to start a business together, a fresh start, a real chance at something better. But those plans fell apart fast. Instead of working, Eddie got lost in drugs. Crack, angel dust, LSD, one addiction led to another. He stopped trying, stopped caring, and while he spiraled further down, Tim stayed on track, still living at his mother Betty's house in Castleberry, Florida. That summer, Eddie became a regular at the Dick family's gatherings. Betty had built her life around her family after losing her husband, turning her home into a place filled with love and laughter. Kids ran through the house, grandkids played in the yard, and there was always warmth at the table. It was the kind of home Eddie had never really known, but instead of finding comfort in it, he was about to destroy it. Betty had a big heart, maybe too big. She welcomed Eddie in like he was one of her own, treating him not as an outsider, but as family. To the kids, he was the fun uncle, especially to Toni. He had a way of making them laugh, always joking, always playing the clown. He seemed easygoing, carefree. But behind the jokes, behind the charm, was something much darker. Eddie had a past, assaults, theft, even a shooting. But Betty and her family never saw that side of him. To them, he was just Eddie, a little troubled maybe, but harmless. Then, Tim moved out, leaving his old room at Betty's house empty. And when she found out Eddie had nowhere to stay, she didn't hesitate. She gave him a home, a kindness that would cost her everything. On the night of September 19th, 1993, Eddie went to a party at Todd Van Fossen's house, just 2 blocks from where he was renting a room. He showed up around 6 p.m. and spent the night drinking, laughing, blending in. By 10:30 p.m., the party was winding down. Todd's girlfriend, Tina, noticed how drunk he was. Concerned, she asked if he wanted to stay the night and sleep it off, but Eddie refused. He had other plans. On his way home, he ran into Jerry Pearson, a neighbor who had just come back from a convenience store. They stood outside, talking for about 10 minutes. Eddie admitted to drinking, but something was off. He didn't seem nearly as drunk as he should have been. Then, right in front of Jera, he pulled out 10 tabs of LSD and swallowed them all at once, like it was nothing. Still restless, Eddie wasn't ready to go home. Instead, he made a stop at Tim's house, drank some gin, and kept the night going. By the time he finally walked through Betty's front door, the house was quiet. The 4 grandchildren were asleep in the living room, completely unaware of the danger that had just walked through the door. 9-year-old Wendy woke up for a moment, just enough to see Eddie standing there, laughing to himself. He looked drunk, but there was something off about him. He wandered into the kitchen, made himself a sandwich, and then went to his room. The house fell silent again. At some point, Eddie returned to the living room and grabbed 8-year-old Toni Neuner by the neck, pressing so hard that he could hear the bones in her neck crack. Thinking she was already dead, he carried her to his room, removed her clothes, and sexually assaulted her. Toni never made a sound or fought back. Afterward, he threw her behind his bed against the wall, where she died as a result of the strangulation. But the horror of what he had already done wasn't enough. He wanted more, so he stormed into Betty's bedroom, intent to assault her too. She never had a chance to react. Before she could even open her eyes, Eddie raised a heavy pewter candlestick and brought it crashing down on her head. She screamed, "Why, Eddie, why?" Her screams woke up Wendy, who ran to see what was happening. At that moment, Wendy saw Eddie stabbing her grandmother. When Eddie noticed her, he grabbed her, tied her up, and locked her in the bathroom. Believing Betty was still alive, Eddie went to the kitchen, got a butcher knife, and returned to stab her again in the back. Afterward, he removed her pajama bottoms, but did not proceed further. Covered in blood, Eddie stepped into the shower, letting the water wash away the horror of what he had just done. Just feet away, 9-year-old Wendy remained tied up in the bathroom, too scared to move. When he was done, Eddie calmly packed his things, walked into Betty's room, and went through her belongings. He grabbed her purse, her jewelry, anything he could sell, then slipped out the door. Moments later, Betty's car was gone, and Eddie had vanished into the night. For nearly 3 weeks, he managed to stay off the radar, traveling across the country and selling the stolen jewelry for cash, but his face was everywhere. America's Most Wanted aired a segment about the murders, and on October 6, 1993, a viewer spotted him at an unemployment office in Bakersfield, California. One call to the police, and Eddie's time on the run was over. Once arrested, he didn't even try to deny it. He sat in an interrogation room and gave 2 videotaped confessions, calmly detailing everything he had done. The jury would later watch those tapes, listening as he described, in his own words, the nightmare he had created. At trial, psychiatrists described Eddie as a man broken by years of drug addiction, depression, and personality disorders. His defense argued that his mind was so damaged by substance abuse that he couldn't fully control his actions. But the prosecution made sure the jury stayed focused on the truth. 2 innocent lives had been taken in a brutal, unforgivable crime. On April 5, 1995, Eddie pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with charges of child abuse, attempted sexual battery, kidnapping, and theft. By August 18, 1995, the jury sentenced him to death for the murders of Toni Neuner and Betty Dick. For the other charges, he received additional sentences ranging from 15 years to life. For the next 30 years, Eddie sat on death row, waiting. Appeal after appeal was denied. And then the day finally came. On March 20, 2025, inside Florida State Prison, the state carried out his execution. Eddie had no visitors on the last day of his life and gave no final statement. His final meal has not yet been publicly disclosed. Keep an eye on the comments for updates. He died at 8:15 p.m. The family of his victims said this puts an end to the hold he had over them for decades. "My mother lived life to the fullest, and she is now gone," she said. "Toni never got to live, and we just wish you guys could understand the power that he had over this family for 31 years. At 63 years old, Edward Thomas James was pronounced dead.